But tonight we're going to talk about Neal's equally terrific book on Walt Disney. And Neal, if you could take us back and create for us, as you do so well in the book, the world Walt Disney grew up in, what his childhood was like, and if you found the sort of rosebud moment that propelled him to become what he eventually did become.
Well, you know, I'm very careful when I choose the first line of a book. And the first line of this book, which I chose very carefully because it, I believe, resonates throughout the rest of the book, and by the way, I should add parenthetically that when they did the audio book and the truncated version, one of the first things they did is cut the first line of the book. They sent me the script, and I said, which was 1/3 the length of the manuscript, and asked me would I approve the changes, because I guess contractually they have to put on the back of the audio cassette that the authors approve the abridgment. And I just said, just restore the first line. I'm not going to look at anything else. And the first line of the book is Elias Disney, who was Walt Disney's father, was a hard man. Now, I say that resonates throughout the rest of the book because in order to understand Walt Disney and the world he created and the fact that he created an alternative universe that he not only lived in, but that all of us growing up and even as adults came to live in, was an alternative universe to the world that his father, that hard man, that man who never cursed, that man who worked his fingers to the bone, that man who was described, I describe him in the book as anhedonic, a man who never had any joy, a man who was described by one of Walt's childhood friends, close childhood friends, as churchy. They were very churchy people, the Disneys, very religious. But the reason I bring this up is because Walt Disney, for the rest of his life, although he only spent a very few years of his life in this town of Marceline, always remembered this as the idyllic passage of his life. This was the time when, you know, he'd ride pigs. This was the time where he'd accompany the local doctor on his rounds as the doctor would tell stories, or would go to the local drugstore and listen to Civil War veterans exchange their Civil War stories. This was the place where he was fortunate enough, his parents decided to withhold him from starting school so that he could accompany his younger sister to school and be in the same class with him. Terribly embarrassing because he was 2 years older than everyone in his class, not only in Marceline, but later when they moved to Kansas City. He was much older than everyone in the class, but that meant that for 2 years he didn't go to school when he was of school age. So Walt Disney looked upon these years as wonderful years, and I don't think that it's too much of a stretch, because Walt has alluded to this more or less throughout his life, that in some ways he spent his life trying to recover Eden. And Eden was Marceline, because what preceded it and what succeeded it when the family moved from Marceline, because as I said, the father had no aptitude for farming whatsoever, and ultimately the farm went belly up and he sold it and moved the family to Kansas City where he ran that paper out I described earlier. That was a terrible passage of Walt's life. So it was preceded by a terrible passage, succeeded by a terrible passage, and there was in the middle of this sandwich of Dickensian childhood and poverty and hardship this wonderful time. And you see it framed in the animations. Walt's love of animals, Walt's sense of nature. All of these things, Walt himself says, you don't have to take this on my authority, Walt himself says, harkened back to those few years that he spent in Marceline, which he once said, you know, more formative things happened to me in Marceline, Missouri than in any other place or any other time in my life. That's his rosebud, really.
And I mean, he recreates that town physically in Disney World and Disneyland. I mean, we know Disney World and Disneyland from Main Street, USA.
Disneyland recapitulates Walt Disney's life. And I describe this in the book because when you enter Disneyland, as Michael said, what do? You walk down the main street of Marceline, Missouri when Walt Disney was a little boy. And when you reach the end of that street, with all of the accoutrements of that main street in Marceline, and in the book I have a picture of it so you can see the similarity between Main Street, USA. It's called Main Street, USA. I always love that. The Disney company is very particular about how you name things. And they insist that you call it Main Street, USA, not just Main Street. So here's Main Street, USA, and you get to the end of Main Street, USA, as Walt Disney himself did. as a boy. And then you have the extensions out into the various lands, the fantasy land, adventure land, frontier land,
you have Walt's imagination then opening up for you.
Exactly. You have Walt's imagination opening up, and you can take any of these roads, which is exactly how Walt perceived the park. I mean, Walt perceived the park as you being a protagonist, not being a guest, but being a protagonist in a narrative. He was always very cinematic when he talked about the park. Even down to, and I describe this in the book, the way that the ground from one land to another at the border would change, because he says you could feel through your feet the change in the narrative as you went from being in a fantasy world to a frontier world. And I should add parenthetically as well that one of the things that makes Disneyland and Disney World so vastly different from any amusement parks that preceded it is that the amusement park generally was predicated on a sense of chaos. That once you entered the amusement park, when you went to Coney Island, for example...
It was immigrant culture.
It was immigrant culture. Yeah. And it was a place in which, like the old carnival days of the Middle Ages, where everything was turned upside down, and the people at the bottom were suddenly at the top. Well, you go to Coney Island, or any of the Palisades Park, or any of the traditional amusement parks, and things were chaotic, and things were wild, and there was noise, and there was, the idea was thrill, and the idea was excitement. You know, when you go to Disneyland, it's the antithesis of that. Disneyland is about control. Disneyland isn't about chaos. Disneyland is about order. And that's one of the things that real contributions that Walt Disney made to the whole notion of a theme park or an amusement park. Disney was a target through much of his life, particularly among the intellectual class. A target, as Michael just pointed out, as someone who sanitized everything, took the danger out of everything, kind of made everything, turned everything into treacle. And that Disneyland was really the manifestation of this. There is no danger at Disneyland, as I just described it. Unlike traditional amusement parks. Everything is under control. Everything is sanitized. Everything is harmonious. Now, that is a criticism that I think Walt's answer would be, look at, and I think it's a logical answer, if you want reality, you don't have to pay for it. You live within it. But that berm that surrounds Disneyland is both a physical and a psychological barrier. When you cross it so that you can escape reality, that you don't have to be within reality. What is Walt Disney to do? Build Holocaust land? The terrors of the 20th century that Walt Disney was fighting against were terrors that Walt Disney allowed you to escape to some degree. Now, the same criticisms were made of his films, that Walt Disney took fairy tales and bowdlerized them, destroyed them, again, took all the magic out of them.
He took the brutal Bettelheim aspect out of the fairy tales.
Which is one of the things that Bettelheim says about Disney. That's also a criticism that is predicated on not watching the movies. Because if you watch the movies, as I had to do for the book, and I watched everything serially. I did everything in this book serially. I went through all of Walt's papers, and they are voluminous, which is why it took me 7 years to write the book. I went through all of Walt's papers chronologically. And I did that for you. This is an act of altruism. Now, not really, but this is why I did it. Because Walt Disney, we all know, becomes tremendously successful. But Walt Disney didn't know that at any given point in his life. And I think if you're a good writer, what you try and do is convey to the reader what Walt is thinking and feeling at any given point in his life. So what I tried to do is stay with Walt throughout his life, feel what he was feeling, try and channel him, because Walt didn't know the end. And what I tried to do constantly, and what I asked the reader to do, is suspend your knowledge. Stay with Walt. I think it makes the book more exciting. It makes Walt more tangible. But, having said that, let me guess back. I know that was a detour, because the issue here is the sanitization of the animations. And if you look at them, a whole generation, more than one generation, was traumatized by the death of Bambi's mother. Treacle? I can't tell you how many letters I read in Walt's files from outraged parents whose children had nightmares after watching Snow White and her flight through the forest, where the trees are clawing at. Treacle? You know, Dumbo.
Millicent in Sleeping Beauty terrified me as a child.
Dumbo losing his mother. I mean, one film after another of the great films, the so-called golden, the classic films in the golden age of Disney, are terrifying movies that grapple with real issues. And that's why it's fashionable to disregard Walt Disney now. But in order to do that, you also have to write a complete revisionist history of his movies. Now, having said that, I will also say, lest you think that I'm just an apologist for Walt Disney, that if you read the book, you'll see that I'm pretty hard on Walt because he makes a lot of really lousy movies. The only thing that can be said in his defense is he knows it, he hates it, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with those movies that are lousy. And in effect, he doesn't. Because Walt Disney reaches a point in his life, relatively early actually, where he comes to the conclusion that the animations will never be as good as they were in that so-called golden age, from Snow White to Bambi. And when he comes to that realization, he operates on the psychological principle of renunciation, which is, I have to kind of put my name on these things because that's what the studio is doing, churning this crap out. But I will not have any emotional investment in them. And so while it may dishearten some of you to hear this, because I know if you're like me, you like some of these films like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland and Lady and the Tramp. But Walt Disney has nothing to do with those movies.